My name is Anjali Mehra, and I've been volunteering at the Northern Wildlife Sanctuary for nearly 8 years now. I've witnessed dozens of rescues, heartbreaking and heartwarming stories of animals brought back from the brink. But nothing, not a single case, has ever left a mark on me the way Raja did. This is the true story of a tiger cub who was never meant to survive and somehow did. And I had the honor of witnessing every moment of his second chance at life. It started in the suffocating heat of late June 2022. The monsoons hadn't arrived yet, and the city baked under a ruthless sun. That's when I got the first call from one of our staff veterinarians, Dr. Samir. I was on a scheduled break from my duties, spending a few days with my parents in Pune, when he rang. "There's been a raid," he said, no pleasantries. "The Forest Department, with Wildlife Crime Control Bureau assistance. Big one. Somewhere near Nagpur. They found a cub, maybe 3 months old, in awful condition." My heart skipped. I'd heard of raids before, some successful, many not, but they rarely led to anything more than confiscated pelts or bones. A live cub? That was almost unheard of. I dropped everything and boarded the next train back. When I reached the sanctuary 2 days later, Raja had just arrived. He was tiny, shockingly so. When I first saw him, he was huddled in a darkened corner of the isolation ward, buried beneath a thermal blanket, hooked to an IV. His fur was matted, dull, patchy in places where fleas had made homes. His ribs stuck out, and his tail was motionless, like a rope dropped from a ledge. His eyes were half open, the whites showing. For a second, I thought he was blind. Dr. Samir was already with him. "Severe dehydration, parasitic infection, undernourishment," he said. "And that's just the beginning." We didn't know where he came from exactly, only that the traffickers had smuggled him in a fruit crate, hidden beneath a tarp in a van. They were trying to transport him across state borders when the tip-off came in. The crate had no bedding, no ventilation. He'd been trapped inside it for over 20 hours when the authorities raided the hideout. We later learned he hadn't been fed for nearly 2 days before that. The traffickers were part of a larger ring, an international network with roots in the illegal wildlife trade. Tigers like Raja were considered high-value assets. If they survived infancy, they'd be sold to exotic pet collectors, private menageries, or worse, harvested for body parts sold in black market medicinal trades across Asia. Raja's case caught the attention of national news, but here, inside the sanctuary's walls, it was simply about survival. For the first week, we weren't allowed to interact with him beyond necessary care. He was too fragile. He was fed every 3 hours, small, warm quantities of goat's milk and a specialized electrolyte mixture. His breathing was labored, and he cried in short, pitiful mewls, like a kitten lost in a thunderstorm. It broke all our hearts. I volunteered for the night shifts. I'd sit outside his enclosure, silent except for the faint beep of the monitoring equipment. Once, I remember falling asleep next to the enclosure wall, curled up in a blanket, and waking up to the soft sound of him trying to stand. That was the first time I saw him make any attempt to move. That moment, watching him wobble and then collapse gently into the bedding, felt like the first sign of hope. Over the next few weeks, Raja began to respond. His appetite picked up, and his temperature stabilized. We started introducing soft meat into his diet, and the transformation was slow, but unmistakable. His coat grew shinier. His eyes began to glow amber, and he started exploring, tentatively at first, then with growing boldness. But it wasn't just his body that was healing. Something deeper had started shifting. You could see it in the way he began recognizing people, drive. Samir, the vet techs, and even me. He'd press against the enclosure wall when I arrived, sometimes letting out the tiniest growl that sounded more like a purr. He was still not allowed human contact, as per the strict no-bonding policy for animals being considered for rehabilitation, but we made exceptions for Raja. His trauma was too deep. He needed to feel safe before he could grow. One day, after nearly 2 months of recovery, we moved him to an outdoor enclosure, a secure, leafy space where he could feel the wind and smell the trees. I remember opening the transfer crate and watching him freeze for a full minute. His muscles tensed, nose twitching, eyes scanning the strange new world in front of him. Then, all at once, he bolted, not in fear, but in joy. He ran, clumsy and fast, across the grass, leaping into the air with a kind of reckless glee I can only describe as freedom. I watched with tears in my eyes. It was then that the sanctuary director, Mr. Kapoor, began serious talks with the Central Zoo Authority. Raja wasn't just a rescue case anymore. He had the potential to become part of something much larger, India's national tiger conservation effort. With his young age, resilience, and partial rehabilitation success, he was a rare candidate for the captive breeding and reintroduction program. But there was a long road ahead. Tigers that survive black market trafficking rarely reintegrate. Many die young. Others are so psychologically scarred they can't adapt to other tigers or show aggression toward handlers or companions. Raja would need to be monitored constantly, not just for health, but for behavior, temperament, and genetic viability. The first step? Introduction to other tigers. When I think about Raja's early days at the sanctuary now, they feel like a prologue to the real story. The part where survival turns into resilience, and resilience becomes something stronger. Identity. His fight for life had brought him back from the brink. But it was his adaptation, his capacity to trust, to learn, to remember how to be a tiger, that defined who he would become. The outdoor enclosure had been a huge turning point. It was about 100 feet long and 50 feet across, ringed with high, reinforced fences and hidden cameras at every angle. There were trees, a shallow pond, grassy mounds, and a shaded den made from old logs. It was as close to the wild as we could manage within sanctuary limits. For the first 2 weeks, Raja was tentative. He paced a lot, sniffed constantly, and avoided the open pond. But then something clicked. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe just curiosity. He began scratching trees, hunting fallen branches, and stretching in the sun like he owned the place. His health markers improved steadily. Blood work showed normalized levels. His parasites were gone. He gained over 4 kilograms in just a month. And more importantly, his behaviors were changing. He was starting to act like a tiger cub. I was assigned as one of the 4 volunteers who would monitor his behavioral adaptation phase, under the supervision of our lead wildlife biologist, Dr. Kavita Rao. We worked in 6-hour shifts, logging every movement, every sound, every interaction Raja had with his environment. Our task wasn't just to observe but to interpret. Was he showing fear responses? Was he aggressive or playful? Did he respond to vocal cues? Was he beginning to stalk, mark territory, or respond to scent trails? It was tedious at times, especially during the hot afternoons, but I never minded. Because watching Raja meant watching the slow emergence of something profound, autonomy. Then came the big question, was he ready to meet another tiger? Dr. Kavita was cautious. He's still young. We don't want to trigger defensive aggression. If he associates fear with another tiger this early, it could complicate everything. The candidate was a slightly older female cub named Tara, rescued from a roadside circus 6 months earlier. Unlike Raja, she hadn't suffered starvation or abuse, but she had lived in a tiny cage for most of her early life. She was wary, dominant, and highly territorial. The plan wasn't to house them together, just to allow visual and olfactory contact from adjacent enclosures. The first introduction was nerve-wracking. We lined their enclosures side by side, with a double safety buffer in between. Raja caught Tara's scent before he saw her. He froze, lowered his body, ears flat. Then he stood up, tail flicking, and let out a short, sharp chuff. It wasn't a growl. It was something close to a greeting. Tara responded by leaping up onto her wooden platform and watching him from above, eyes locked. She didn't growl either. For a few minutes, they just stared at each other. Then Raja sat down, rolled onto his side, and exposed his belly, a clear signal of submission. I looked over at Dr. Kavita, and I remember her whispering, "That's unexpected." In the days that followed, they continued to interact through the barrier. There were a few tense moments, especially when food was involved, but overall, their behavior remained inquisitive and cautious rather than hostile. We took our time. After 2 weeks, they began parallel feeding, each receiving food at the same time but in sight of one another. No signs of distress, no aggression, just curiosity. Eventually, we began short, supervised, shared enclosure sessions. That first direct interaction was something I'll never forget. Raja approached Tara with slow, deliberate steps, head low, tail flicking. She stood still, tense. When he got within a meter, she suddenly lunged, not to attack, but to swipe at him playfully. Raja jumped back, startled, then swatted the ground like he was laughing. It was the beginning of a bond. Not a deep one. Tigers are solitary animals by nature, but one built on mutual tolerance and recognition. They began to eat near each other, rest in the same shaded areas, even share a water bowl. Over time, they developed their own rhythm. Raja was always the more submissive one, Tara the explorer. Raja still had a long way to go. He wasn't a candidate for release into the wild yet. There were protocols, tests, behaviors he had to exhibit before he could even be considered. But the idea of captive breeding and potential release became more realistic with each passing week. One of the key components of the conservation program was genetic analysis. India's wild tiger population had dangerously low genetic diversity in certain regions, and Raja, having been rescued so young and with no known parental records, became a genetically significant specimen once his DNA was sequenced. His lineage couldn't be traced to any known sanctuary or reserve population, which meant he potentially carried unique genes, a critical piece of the puzzle for long-term species viability. By October 2022, Raja had been at the sanctuary for 4 months. His weight had nearly tripled. He was active, alert, and behaviorally stable. We introduced live prey simulations, rubber balls filled with meat, hanging carcasses, and scent trails. Raja took to them instinctively. Watching him stalk was like watching water find its level, effortless and elegant. But not everything was perfect. Raja remained fearful of loud noises. Sudden movements triggered flinches. We believed it was a remnant of his trauma, likely from his time in the crate, or during the raid. These triggers had to be documented and accounted for in any future planning. Raja could never be released into a noisy or high-traffic reserve. He would need a controlled environment or, more likely, a role as a breeding male in a semi-wild facility. The decision to keep him as part of the breeding program was finalized in January 2023. The Central Zoo Authority and National Tiger Conservation Authority approved his long-term integration into the semi-wild conservation facility in Madhya Pradesh, a sprawling, forest-buffered reserve that mimicked natural habitat while allowing for controlled breeding and reintroduction efforts. It wasn't true wilderness, but it was the closest Raja would likely ever come. The last few weeks before his transfer were emotional. We kept our routines steady, avoiding changes that might stress him. I spent as much time as I could during the observation windows, sitting by the enclosure, documenting his interactions, and occasionally talking to him softly through the mesh. I knew he recognized my voice. He always turned toward me when I spoke. On the morning of his transfer, I helped prepare his crate. It was large, steel-framed, with a thick wooden base lined with straw and infused with the scents of his favorite logs and toys. We sedated him lightly, not full anesthesia, just enough to keep him calm. He went in without a fuss. Before they shut the doors, I knelt beside the crate and whispered, "You did it, Raja. You made it." He looked at me, eyes half-lidded but aware. And in that second, I felt the full weight of the journey he'd made, from a trafficker's crate to the threshold of a life he'd never imagined. That was the end of his time at our sanctuary, but not the end of his story. By the time Raja arrived at the Conservation Breeding Reserve in Madhya Pradesh in early February 2023, he was no longer a symbol of pity or tragedy. He had become, in every meaningful way, a young tiger. Still growing, still learning, but no longer broken. The facility was unlike anything I had ever seen. Situated near the edge of the Satpura forest range, the reserve was a sprawling 300-acre area of forested land secured with minimal human interference. It wasn't open to tourists. It wasn't a zoo. This was a place specifically built for the conservation of endangered species, particular emphasis on large carnivores like tigers and leopards, animals rescued from illegal trade, conflict zones, or human encroachment. Unlike the sanctuary where Raja had spent his early months, this reserve operated under strict protocols. Contact between humans and tigers was minimal. There were no names spoken aloud around the animals. There were no familiar voices or comforting routines. The goal here was to strip the last remnants of dependency and prepare animals like Raja for semi-autonomous lives. I wasn't supposed to go. As a volunteer, my responsibilities technically ended when Raja left our facility. But I couldn't let it go. I applied for a temporary research assistant role through a partnership program between our sanctuary and the conservation reserve. I was accepted for a 3-month rotation. When I arrived, I asked the lead coordinator, a seasoned field biologist named Raghav Singh, about Raja. He looked at his clipboard and said, "Male, approximately 11 months old. One of the best physical condition rescues we've received in 2 years. Slight trauma sensitivity, excellent prey simulation responses. Has potential as a breeding male, if he adjusts." That word, if, hung in the air. Raja's story had always carried that word. He had been placed in a large transitional enclosure with high forest cover, natural prey scents, mock dens, and no visual barrier to the sky. A small stream ran through one side. Camera traps and motion sensors monitored his movement 24/7. Unlike before, I wasn't allowed to interact with him. Not directly. My role was observational only. The first time I saw him again was through the monitor screen. He was stalking a baited scent trail laid by the staff. His body was lean, strong, and fluid. The kitten softness was gone. In its place was a streamlined hunter, precise and deliberate. He paused at the stream's edge, sniffed the air, and padded into the water without hesitation. The shyness from his early outdoor enclosure days was gone. I leaned back from the screen, stunned. This wasn't just recovery. This was transformation. But adaptation was still being tested. Raja had not yet encountered a real prey animal. All his training had been based on artificial lures or behavioral simulations. Before he could be considered part of the breeding pool, he would undergo a phase known as predator conditioning. He would be introduced to naturalistic hunting scenarios using live prey under controlled, ethical conditions. I remember feeling uneasy about that. The idea of releasing a goat or deer into his enclosure felt harsh. But I understood it was necessary. Raja needed to learn behaviors he was never taught by his mother. Survival instincts don't always kick in on their own. The first test was a small chital deer. It was healthy and agile, capable of outrunning a young tiger not yet fully grown. The entire process was monitored carefully. The release occurred in the early evening, and we watched through the thermal monitors as the deer stepped into the outer enclosure. For a while, nothing happened. Then, just after sunset, we saw Raja emerge. He moved low, fast, silent. He tracked the deer for over 45 minutes before initiating the chase. He didn't catch it that night. But he came close. On the third day, he succeeded. He approached from downwind, used the tree cover perfectly, and launched with full force. It was a clean kill, fast, efficient. Textbook instinct. Raja had crossed a major threshold. He was no longer just surviving. He was hunting. And he was doing it well. The behavioral team documented the entire process. A few weeks later, he passed a second critical test, interspecies coexistence. He was moved into a larger forested enclosure adjacent to another subadult male and 2 females, all born in captivity but conditioned for semi-wild life. These interactions were more complex. Tigers are solitary, but breeding centers rely on a level of managed cohabitation to mimic natural behaviors. Raja proved unusually adaptable. He didn't challenge the other male. He used scent marking and vocalizations in textbook fashion. He showed mild interest in the females but didn't overstep social boundaries. In short, he was learning how to be part of a dynamic, territorial system, just as he would in the wild. By the end of my 3-month rotation, Raja was officially listed as a candidate for the controlled breeding program. That decision wasn't about genetics alone, though he was indeed genetically valuable. It was about behavior, maturity, and adaptability. He had passed the tests. The plan was to pair him in the coming season with one of the females from his enclosure. If successful, their offspring could one day be part of reintroduction efforts in buffer zones around national parks, areas where human-tiger conflict had reduced population viability, and where new bloodlines were desperately needed. Before I left, I visited his enclosure one last time, not up close, of course. But I stood beyond the observation fence at dawn, watching the forest move in soft shadows. Then, as if summoned by some quiet understanding, he appeared. He didn't look at me. He didn't come close. He simply walked past the tree line, stopped by the stream, and drank. And in that moment, I realized I didn't need him to recognize me anymore. He didn't need comfort. He didn't need names. He had found his own rhythm. Raja was a tiger. It's been over a year now. I still get updates from Raghav now and then. Last I heard, Raja had successfully sired 2 cubs. Twins. Strong, healthy, curious. Their genetic profiles are being monitored closely. There are discussions, long-term of course, about future release possibilities, into heavily protected buffer zones where they might one day live as truly wild tigers. I don't know if I'll ever see Raja again in person. But I do know this. In the world of conservation, most stories don't end with victory. They end with compromise, exhaustion, and uncertainty. But Raja's story was different. It began in the darkest corners of cruelty, in a box meant to kill his spirit. And yet, somehow, it became a story of survival, strength, and hope. And for those of us who bore witness, from the forest officers who pulled him from that crate to the biologists who gave him a new life, Raja will always be more than just a tiger. He will be proof that even in a world that profits from extinction, survival is still possible.